When Jasmine Crockett called Trump "wannabe Hitler" on live television, all of America held its breath. But what was truly shocking was her explanation of why she used such harsh language, because she had documents related to the Epstein files that proved exactly why Trump didn't want those files released. And when Republicans heard this, they started fleeing the room. The morning of July 15th felt different in Washington, D.C. There was electricity in the air, the kind that precedes a thunderstorm, and everyone on Capitol Hill seemed to sense that something significant was about to happen. In the halls of the Rayburn House office building, staffers hurried past each other with tense expressions, checking their phones constantly for breaking news alerts that everyone knew were coming, but no one could predict. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett arrived at her office earlier than usual that morning. She had spent most of the previous night reviewing classified briefing materials and preparing for what she knew would be one of the most important congressional appearances of her career. The documents spread across her desk told a story that went far beyond partisan politics. They revealed a pattern of corruption, manipulation, and abuse of power that threatened the very foundations of American democracy. The catalyst for today's hearing was President Trump's sudden announcement that he would direct his Attorney General, Pam Bondi, to request the release of grand jury testimony related to the Jeffrey Epstein case. On the surface, this appeared to be a gesture of transparency, a president willing to shed light on one of the most notorious criminal cases in recent memory. But Jasmine, with her background as a prosecutor and her experience in identifying legal manipulations, recognized it for what it truly was: a carefully orchestrated deception designed to give the appearance of cooperation while actually ensuring that the most damaging information would remain hidden. The key to understanding Trump's strategy lay in the specific nature of grand jury proceedings. As any experienced attorney knows, grand jury testimony is protected by strict secrecy rules that make it extremely difficult to release to the public. By specifically requesting grand jury documents, Trump was making a request that sounded transparent, but was actually designed to fail. When the courts inevitably refused to release the protected materials, Trump could claim that he had tried to be transparent, but was blocked by the judicial system. But what Trump didn't know was that Jasmine had obtained access to other Epstein-related documents that weren't protected by grand jury secrecy rules. Materials that painted a far more disturbing picture of his relationship with the convicted sex trafficker than anything the public had previously seen. The House Judiciary Committee hearing was scheduled to begin at 10 a.m., with the ostensible purpose of examining the Department of Justice's handling of high-profile criminal cases. But everyone in the room knew that the real focus would be on the Epstein files and Trump's sudden interest in selective transparency. As committee members filed into the hearing room, the tension was palpable. Republican members huddled together, clearly having received talking points about how to defend Trump's position. Democratic members looked determined but wary, understanding that they were about to navigate treacherous political waters. And in the gallery, reporters from every major news outlet in the country adjusted their cameras and checked their recording equipment, sensing that they were about to witness something extraordinary. Jasmine took her seat at the committee table with a manila folder in front of her, not thick, but substantial enough to suggest that it contained significant materials. She had chosen her attire carefully: a dark blue blazer that conveyed seriousness and authority, minimal jewelry, her hair pulled back in a professional style that emphasized her focused expression. This wasn't a day for political theater or grandstanding. This was a day for truth-telling. The hearing began with standard procedural remarks from the chairman, followed by opening statements from ranking members. But the real fireworks started when Jasmine was recognized for her first round of questioning. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman," she began, her voice calm, but carrying an edge that immediately commanded attention. "I want to begin by addressing the elephant in the room, the president's sudden interest in releasing Epstein-related documents." She opened her folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper. Yesterday, the president announced that he would direct the Attorney General to request the release of grand jury testimony related to the Epstein case. This sounds like transparency, but I submit to this committee that it's actually the opposite. Republican committee member Congressman Jim Jordan immediately objected. The gentlewoman is making accusations without evidence. The president is showing unprecedented transparency by... Jasmine cut him off smoothly. I'm not making accusations, Congressman Jordan. I'm about to present evidence. Evidence that shows this is nothing more than what I can only describe as a con man's game. The phrase hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. Several committee members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. In the gallery, reporters leaned forward, sensing that Jasmine was about to drop a bombshell. The president knows, Jasmine continued, as his attorneys have undoubtedly informed him, that grand jury proceedings are protected by strict secrecy rules. Requesting the release of grand jury documents is like requesting something that everyone knows can't be legally provided. It allows him to play both sides. He can claim he tried to be transparent while ensuring that the most damaging information remains hidden. She pulled out another document from her folder. But what the president doesn't realize is that there are other Epstein-related documents that aren't protected by grand jury secrecy. Documents that I've obtained through proper legal channels and that paint a very different picture of his relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. The room went dead silent. Even the typical background noise of shuffling papers and whispered conversations stopped completely. Republican members began frantically checking their phones, clearly trying to determine if their leadership had prepared them for this development. Jasmine looked directly at the camera that was broadcasting the hearing live to millions of Americans. Before I present these documents, I want the American people to understand what we're really dealing with here. This isn't just about one man or one case. This is about a pattern of behavior that threatens our democratic institutions. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the room. We are dealing with someone who treats the presidency like a business opportunity, who views the Department of Justice as his personal law firm, and who manipulates legal processes to protect himself and his associates while prosecuting his political enemies. Congressman Jordan tried to interrupt again. Mr. Chairman, the gentlewoman is making inflammatory statements without... I'm getting to the evidence right now, Jasmine said firmly. She held up a document with official FBI letterhead. This is a summary report from the FBI's analysis of Jeffrey Epstein's communications, including phone records, email exchanges, and calendar appointments. What it shows is extensive contact between Epstein and individuals connected to the Trump Organization during the period 2015 to 2017. She clicked to display the document on the room's monitors. These contacts weren't just social interactions. They involved discussions about real estate transactions, investment opportunities, and what the FBI describes as mutual business interests of an undisclosed nature. Republican committee members were now visibly agitated. Several were typing furiously on their phones, clearly trying to coordinate a response with Trump's communications team. But Jasmine wasn't finished. More concerning, she continued, are the references in these communications to what Epstein called insurance policies, materials that he claimed would protect him and his associates from prosecution. The FBI analysis suggests that these insurance policies involved compromising information about powerful individuals, including political figures. The implications were staggering. If Epstein had been collecting blackmail material on political figures, and if Trump had been aware of this, it would explain his desperate efforts to control what information became public. But Jasmine's most devastating revelation was yet to come. Which brings me to why I use the term that I'm about to use, she said, her voice taking on a prosecutorial edge that anyone who had watched her in previous hearings would recognize. The pattern of behavior we're seeing, the manipulation of legal processes, the use of government power to protect personal interests, the silencing of investigations that might expose corruption. This isn't just standard political corruption. She looked directly at the camera again, knowing that her next words would be replayed on news programs for days to come. This is the behavior of someone who views himself as above the law, who believes that democratic institutions exist to serve his personal interests rather than the American people. This is the behavior of what I can only describe as a wannabe Hitler. The room erupted. Republican members shouted objections. Reporters frantically typed on their laptops. In the gallery, several people audibly gasped, but Jasmine continued speaking, her voice cutting through the chaos with laser-like precision. "I don't use that comparison lightly," she said. "But when someone uses the power of the presidency to manipulate justice, to silence investigations, and to protect themselves and their associates from accountability, they are following the playbook of authoritarian dictators throughout history." Congressman Jordan was on his feet, yelling about decorum and inappropriate comparisons. Other Republican members were calling for Jasmine's words to be stricken from the record. But the damage was done. The comparison had been made, and more importantly, it had been made with documented evidence to support it. As the chaos continued, something remarkable happened. One by one, Republican committee members began quietly leaving the hearing room. Not dramatically or obviously, but in the subtle way that politicians use when they don't want to be on record supporting something indefensible. First, Congressman Matt Gaetz slipped out during a particularly heated exchange, claiming he had an urgent phone call. Then, Congressman Lauren Boebert followed, citing a scheduling conflict. Within 20 minutes, half of the Republican committee members had found excuses to absent themselves from the hearing. Jasmine watched this exodus with the calm satisfaction of someone who had predicted exactly this response. She had known that when confronted with documented evidence of Trump's corruption, Republicans would choose flight over fight. They couldn't defend the indefensible, so they simply removed themselves from the situation. "Mr. Chairman," Jasmine said as the room began to settle, "I note for the record that several of our Republican colleagues have chosen to leave rather than address the evidence I've presented. I think that speaks volumes about the strength of their convictions." But Jasmine wasn't finished. She had one more document to present, and it would prove to be the most damaging of all. "This final document," she said, holding up a letter with Department of Justice letterhead, "is a communication from the FBI to the Department of Justice leadership, dated 3 weeks ago. It warns that the release of certain Epstein-related materials could compromise ongoing investigations into sex trafficking networks." She let that sink in for a moment. Think about what this means. The president is demanding the release of documents that the FBI says could damage investigations into child sex trafficking. He's willing to potentially harm children to protect his own reputation. The remaining Republican members sat in stunned silence. There was no way to spin this revelation into something positive for Trump. The man who claimed to be fighting against child trafficking was potentially sabotaging actual investigations into those crimes. Jasmine closed her folder and leaned back in her chair. "So when my Republican colleagues ask me why I would compare the president to Hitler, I would ask them this. What would you call someone who uses presidential power to protect sex traffickers and silence investigations into crimes against children? What would you call someone who manipulates the justice system to serve his personal interests while claiming to be fighting for law and order?" The hearing room was so quiet, you could hear the air conditioning system cycling on and off. Even the reporters had stopped typing, recognizing that they were witnessing a moment that would be studied in history books. But the most powerful moment was still to come. As Jasmine gathered her papers, preparing to yield her time, she did something unexpected. She pulled out one final document, not an official government paper, but something that looked personal, handwritten. "Before I yield my time, Mr. Chairman, I want to read something into the record. This is a letter that I received yesterday from a constituent in my district, a mother whose daughter was a victim of trafficking." The room went completely silent. Even the Republican members who remained stopped their whispering and looked up. "Congresswoman Crockett," Jasmine read, her voice softer now but somehow more powerful, "I heard that you were going to be asking questions about the Epstein case. I wanted you to know that my daughter Sarah was trafficked when she was 16. It took 3 years for law enforcement to find her and bring her home. Every day that investigations were delayed, every day that evidence was hidden, was another day that she suffered." Jasmine paused, the weight of the letter evident in her expression. "Please don't let politics prevent justice for girls like my daughter. Please don't let powerful men escape accountability while our children pay the price." She folded the letter carefully and looked around the room. "That's why I won't stay silent. That's why I won't play political games. And that's why I'll call out authoritarian behavior wherever I see it, regardless of who engages in it. The aftermath of the hearing was unlike anything Washington had seen in years. Within hours, clips of Jasmine calling Trump a wannabe Hitler were trending on every social media platform. But more importantly, her presentation of evidence regarding the Epstein files had opened a new front in the battle for accountability. News outlets scrambled to verify the documents she had presented. Legal experts weighed in on the implications of Trump's grand jury strategy. And across the country, Americans began asking harder questions about what their president might be hiding and why. The White House response was swift but ineffective. Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt held an emergency briefing, claiming that Jasmine's documents were fabricated and her comparisons were unhinged partisan attacks. But when reporters asked for specific rebuttals to the evidence presented, the administration could only offer generic denials. More damaging for Trump was the response from his own party. Several Republican senators issued statements distancing themselves from both his Epstein file strategy and his administration's attacks on Jasmine. Senator Susan Collins called for a full and transparent investigation into all aspects of the Epstein case, regardless of political considerations. Even Fox News struggled to defend Trump's position. Tucker Carlson's replacement spent an entire segment trying to explain why requesting grand jury documents was actually a sign of transparency. But the legal experts he brought on kept pointing out the obvious flaws in that argument. But perhaps the most significant development came 3 days later, when Attorney General Pam Bondi announced that the Department of Justice would be conducting a comprehensive review of all Epstein-related materials to determine what could be released without compromising ongoing investigations. It was a careful bureaucratic way of saying that they were taking Jasmine's concerns seriously while also creating space to distance themselves from Trump's more reckless demands. A week after the hearing, Jasmine appeared on Meet the Press for an extended interview about her accusations and the evidence she had presented. Host Chuck Todd asked her directly whether she regretted using such strong language to describe the president. "Chuck," she replied, "I regret that we live in a time when calling out authoritarian behavior is considered controversial. I regret that protecting children from trafficking has become a partisan issue. But I don't regret speaking truth about someone who uses presidential power to manipulate justice and protect criminals." When Todd asked whether she thought her wannabe Hitler comparison was appropriate, Jasmine's response became another viral moment. "Hitler didn't start with gas chambers," she said. "He started with manipulating legal systems, silencing opposition, and convincing people that his personal interests were the same as the nation's interests. When I see someone following that playbook, I'm going to call it out, regardless of their political party or their position." The interview was viewed by over 12 million people and shared across social media platforms millions of times. But more importantly, it sparked a national conversation about the warning signs of authoritarianism and the responsibility of citizens to recognize and resist them. 6 months later, the FBI's investigation into the trafficking networks connected to the Epstein case resulted in dozens of arrests and the rescue of hundreds of victims. During a press conference announcing the results, FBI Director Christopher Wray specifically thanked members of Congress who prioritized victims over politics and investigation over obstruction. While he didn't mention Jasmine by name, everyone understood who he was referring to. A year after the hearing, Jasmine was invited to speak at the International Conference on Human Trafficking in Geneva, Switzerland. Her speech, titled "Democracy as Child Protection," argued that strong democratic institutions were essential for protecting the most vulnerable members of society. "When we allow powerful people to manipulate justice systems," she told the assembled delegates from around the world, "children pay the price. When we excuse authoritarian behavior because it serves our political interests, we create the conditions that allow trafficking and abuse to flourish." Her speech received a standing ovation from representatives of 147 countries. But for Jasmine, the real measure of success wasn't international acclaim. It was the knowledge that her willingness to speak difficult truths had helped protect children and strengthen democratic institutions. Back in her district office in Texas, she kept the letter from Sarah's mother framed on her wall, a reminder of why she had chosen to speak out even when it was politically risky. Next to it was a photo from the hearing where she had called Trump a wannabe Hitler, not because she was proud of the controversy, but because she was proud of the courage it had taken to tell the truth when truth-telling mattered most. Because that's what democracy requires, not perfect people, but people willing to speak truth to power even when it's uncomfortable, even when it's dangerous, and even when it means standing alone against those who would use democratic institutions to undermine democracy itself. The manila folder that had contained the Epstein evidence now sat in a secure filing cabinet, its contents having sparked investigations, protected children, and demonstrated that in America, no one, not even presidents, should be above the law. And in middle schools and high schools across the country, civics teachers were using clips from Jasmine's hearing to teach students about the importance of institutional accountability, the warning signs of authoritarianism, and the power that ordinary citizens have to demand truth from their leaders. Because sometimes the most important revolutions begin not with violence or protest, but with one person willing to call evil by its name, no matter how powerful the people who embody it might be. But the story of Jasmine Crockett's wannabe Hitler moment was only the beginning. What followed in the weeks and months after that explosive hearing would transform American politics in ways that no one could have predicted, creating ripple effects that would ultimately reshape how the country understood power, accountability, and the fragile nature of democratic institutions. The immediate aftermath was unlike anything Washington had experienced in recent memory. Within 2 hours of Jasmine's testimony, wannabe Hitler was trending #1 on Twitter with over 4 million mentions. But this wasn't just partisan political noise. The hashtag was being used by people across the political spectrum, many of whom were sharing their own stories about recognizing authoritarian behavior in their communities, their workplaces, and their personal relationships. Dr. Sarah Chen, a political scientist at Georgetown University who specialized in authoritarian movements, was watching the hearing live from her office when Jasmine made the comparison. "I've spent my entire career studying how democracies die," she told a reporter later that day. What Congresswoman Crockett did was provide a vocabulary for something that many Americans have been feeling but couldn't articulate. She gave people permission to name what they were seeing. The response from Trump's inner circle was swift and revealing. Within hours, a parade of administration officials appeared on news programs to denounce Jasmine's comments as unhinged, disgraceful, and beneath the dignity of Congress. But their denials rang hollow, because none of them addressed the specific evidence she had presented about the Epstein files manipulation. More telling was what happened behind closed doors. According to sources who would later speak to the Washington Post, Trump was apoplectic when he learned about Jasmine's presentation. He spent the afternoon calling Republican congressional leaders, demanding that they formally censure her and remove her from all committee assignments. But the Republican leadership found themselves in an impossible position. Censuring Jasmine would require them to defend Trump's Epstein files strategy, which even his allies recognized was politically toxic. It would force them to go on record protecting someone who had been accused of manipulating investigations into child trafficking. House Speaker Mike Johnson held an emergency meeting with his leadership team that evening. According to participants, the conversation was tense and revealing. Several members expressed concern that defending Trump on this issue could devastate the party's standing with suburban families, a demographic they desperately needed for the upcoming election. "We can't be seen as the party that protects child traffickers," one member reportedly said. "If we go after Crockett for exposing this, we're going to lose every soccer mom in America." The decision was made to let Jasmine's comments stand without formal response, a silence that many interpreted as tacit acknowledgement that her accusations had merit. Meanwhile, something unprecedented was happening in law enforcement agencies across the country. FBI field offices reported a surge in tips related to trafficking cases, with callers specifically mentioning that they had been inspired by Jasmine's hearing to come forward with information they had previously been afraid to share. Special Agent Maria Rodriguez, who headed the FBI's trafficking task force in Miami, later testified before Congress about this phenomenon. In the week following Congresswoman Crockett's hearing, we received more credible tips than we typically get in a month. People who had been silent for years suddenly felt empowered to speak up. The international response was equally significant. European intelligence agencies that had been monitoring Trump's connections to various criminal networks began sharing information more freely with their American counterparts. The British government quietly opened its own investigation into Trump Organization activities in the UK, while German prosecutors announced they were reviewing financial transactions between Trump entities and European banks. Most dramatically, the government of Switzerland announced that it was freezing several bank accounts connected to entities mentioned in Jasmine's presentation, pending a joint investigation with American law enforcement. But perhaps the most unexpected development came from within the Republican Party itself. 3 weeks after the hearing, Senator Mitt Romney delivered a speech on the Senate floor that would be remembered as one of the most courageous moments of his career. "I have been criticized by members of my own party for speaking out against authoritarian tendencies in our government," Romney said, his voice steady but emotional. "But when a member of Congress presents documented evidence that our justice system is being manipulated to protect criminal networks, silence becomes complicity." Romney went on to call for a bipartisan Senate investigation into all aspects of the Epstein case, including any attempts to obstruct or manipulate related investigations. His speech received a standing ovation from Democratic senators and stunned silence from his Republican colleagues. The speech marked a turning point in how even conservative politicians were willing to discuss Trump's behavior. Romney's willingness to validate Jasmine's concerns gave cover to other Republicans who had been privately expressing similar doubts. Within a month, 12 Republican senators had signed onto Romney's call for investigation. The dam was breaking. Back in Jasmine's district in Texas, something remarkable was happening at the grassroots level. Community organizations, parent groups, and church congregations were organizing what they called truth and accountability meetings, gatherings where people shared their own experiences with authority figures who had abused their power. Pastor David Williams of New Hope Baptist Church in Dallas hosted one of these meetings in his church basement. "Sister Crockett showed us that speaking truth to power isn't just a political slogan," he told his congregation. "It's a moral imperative. When we see evil, we have an obligation to name it." The meeting drew over 200 people from across the political spectrum. A retired police officer spoke about corruption he had witnessed in his department. A teacher talked about administrators who had covered up abuse. A mother shared her story of fighting a school board that had ignored bullying. "What Jasmine did on that day," the mother said, "was show us that one person with courage and evidence can stand up to anyone, no matter how powerful they are." These grassroots meetings began spreading to other communities across Texas and eventually to other states. They became a form of civic education that traditional political organizations had failed to provide. Spaces where people could learn to identify and resist authoritarian behavior in all its forms. The educational impact extended to universities as well. Professor James Patterson at the University of Texas at Austin began teaching a course called Democracy Under Siege, Recognizing and Resisting Authoritarianism. The course waiting list had over 300 students within a week of being announced. "Students are hungry to understand what they're witnessing," Patterson explained. Congresswoman Crockett gave them a framework for analysis. She showed them that calling out authoritarianism isn't hysteria. It's necessary civic engagement. The course became so popular that universities across the country began offering similar classes. Yale Law School created a seminar on legal manipulation and democratic erosion. Harvard's Kennedy School launched a program on institutional defense in democratic societies. But the most significant long-term impact was on American journalism. Jasmine's methodical presentation of evidence, combined with her willingness to use precise language to describe what she was seeing, had set a new standard for political discourse. News organizations began dedicating more resources to investigative reporting and fact-checking. The Columbia Journalism Review published an analysis showing that in the 6 months following Jasmine's hearing, major news outlets published 40% more investigative pieces about government corruption and 60% more articles using specific terms like authoritarian and democratic erosion. Crockett showed journalists that it's not only acceptable but necessary to call things by their actual names, wrote media critic Margaret Sullivan. She demonstrated that precision in language is a form of public service. The impact on political campaigns was equally profound. Democratic candidates across the country began incorporating truth and accountability themes into their messaging. But more importantly, they began demanding higher standards of evidence and documentation in their own campaign communications. Republican candidates found themselves in an increasingly difficult position. They couldn't defend Trump's behavior without alienating moderate voters, but distancing themselves from him risked alienating their base. Many chose to simply avoid discussing the issues Jasmine had raised, a silence that voters increasingly interpreted as complicity. The 2024 election results would later be seen as a direct consequence of the political realignment that began with Jasmine's hearing. Suburban voters, particularly women, shifted decisively toward candidates who had spoken out against authoritarianism and corruption. Exit polls showed that 67% of voters said that protecting democratic institutions was a major factor in their voting decisions. But for Jasmine herself, the measure of success wasn't political victories or policy changes. It was the letters she received from ordinary citizens who had found the courage to speak truth in their own lives. A letter from a college student in Ohio. I reported my professor for plagiarism after watching your hearing. I realized that integrity matters more than grades. A note from a corporate whistleblower in California. Your example gave me the courage to report financial fraud at my company. 3 executives were indicted. A message from a military veteran in North Carolina. I testified about war crimes I witnessed after seeing you stand up to powerful people. It was the hardest and most important thing I've ever done. These letters filled the entire filing cabinet in Jasmine's office, a testament to the ripple effects of one moment of courage expanding into countless acts of integrity across the country. 2 years after the hearing, Jasmine was invited to speak at the National Archives in Washington, where the founding documents of American democracy are preserved. Her speech, titled "The Courage of Calling Things by Their Names," was attended by constitutional scholars, civil rights leaders, and ordinary citizens who had traveled from across the country to hear her. Democracy is not a spectator sport, she told the audience. It requires active participation from citizens who are willing to recognize threats and resist them. It requires people who understand that silence in the face of authoritarianism is not neutrality, it's complicity. She concluded with words that would be carved into the entrance of the Jasmine Crockett Center for Democratic Courage, which was established at her alma mater 5 years later. When you see a wannabe dictator, call them a wannabe dictator. When you see corruption, call it corruption. When you see evil, call it evil. Because in a democracy, the most radical act is simply telling the truth. The standing ovation lasted for 7 minutes, but the impact of her words would last for generations. Teachers would quote them in civics classes. Activists would invoke them at protests. Citizens would remember them in voting booths. And in the marble halls of the Capitol, a new standard had been set for what it meant to serve the American people with courage, integrity, and an unwavering commitment to truth, no matter how powerful the people who preferred lies might be. The manila folder that had contained the Epstein evidence now resided in a climate-controlled archive, but its contents had sparked a movement that was very much alive. A movement based on the radical idea that in America, even the most powerful people should be held accountable to the truth. And sometimes, that's exactly what democracy needs. One person willing to say what everyone else is thinking, armed with evidence and motivated by love of country rather than fear of consequences. The revolution hadn't been violent or dramatic. It had been quiet, methodical, and absolutely devastating to those who had counted on silence to protect their crimes, just the way Jasmine Crockett had planned it. 1,000-word final edition, The International Tribunal and Ultimate Justice. But the story's most dramatic chapter was yet to be written. 5 years after Jasmine Crockett first called Trump a wannabe Hitler on live television, the International Criminal Court at The Hague announced something unprecedented in American history. They would be investigating former President Donald Trump for crimes against humanity, specifically related to systematic obstruction of child trafficking investigations. The announcement came on a cold February morning in 2029, delivered by ICC Chief Prosecutor Fatou Bensouda during a press conference that was broadcast live around the world. Standing behind a podium bearing the court's seal, she explained that the investigation had been triggered by evidence presented by the United States Congress, specifically citing the courageous testimony of Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett and subsequent investigations that revealed systematic efforts to obstruct justice in cases involving crimes against children. The evidence that had led to this moment was overwhelming. The FBI's expanded investigation, sparked by Jasmine's original hearing, had uncovered a vast network of obstruction that went far beyond the Epstein case. Internal DOJ memos revealed that Trump had personally intervened in at least 17 separate trafficking investigations, directing prosecutors to delay arrests, suppress evidence, and avoid pursuing cases that might implicate his associates. Most damaging was the discovery of encrypted communications between Trump and Jeffrey Epstein that had been recovered from a server in the British Virgin Islands. The messages, dating from 2016 to 2019, showed Trump providing Epstein with advance warning about federal investigations and helping him move assets offshore to avoid seizure. One message, sent just days before Epstein's arrest, read, "Problem being handled. Your friends in high places are ensuring minimal exposure. Island assets secured through usual channels." The international legal community was unanimous in its response. Professor Maria Santos of the International Law Institute called it the most significant case of democratic backsliding and abuse of power in modern Western history. Back in the United States, the ICC announcement created a constitutional crisis. Trump's remaining supporters argued that international courts had no jurisdiction over American presidents, while legal scholars pointed out that obstructing investigations into crimes against children fell under universal jurisdiction principles that allowed international prosecution regardless of nationality. Jasmine, now serving her third term in Congress and chairing the House Judiciary Committee, was asked to testify before the ICC as a key witness. Her appearance at The Hague became a moment of profound historical significance. Standing in the same courtroom where war criminals had been tried, Jasmine delivered testimony that was broadcast live to over 200 million viewers worldwide. She spoke for 2 hours, methodically presenting the evidence that had first emerged during that explosive congressional hearing years earlier. "Your Honors," she concluded, "what we discovered was not merely political corruption, but a systematic assault on the most vulnerable members of society. When those entrusted with protecting children instead choose to protect their abusers, they forfeit any claim to democratic legitimacy." The courtroom was silent as she finished, but in the public gallery, family members of trafficking victims wept openly. Many held photographs of their children, some rescued, others still missing. The trial lasted 8 months. Witnesses included former FBI agents, DOJ prosecutors, trafficking survivors, and even some of Trump's former associates who had agreed to testify in exchange for immunity. The evidence was overwhelming and devastating. But perhaps the most powerful moment came when Maria Santos, the mother whose letter Jasmine had read during the original hearing, testified about how the delays in investigation had prolonged her daughter's captivity. "My daughter spent an additional 14 months in trafficking because investigations were delayed for political reasons," she told the court through tears. 14 months of torture because one man valued his reputation more than her life. The verdict was unanimous, guilty on all charges. The court sentenced Trump to 25 years in prison and ordered him to pay $50 million in restitution to trafficking survivors. More importantly, The court issued a landmark ruling establishing that obstruction of investigations into crimes against children constituted a crime against humanity, regardless of the perpetrator's political position. The international legal precedent sent shockwaves through capitals around the world. Within a year, similar investigations were launched against political figures in 12 countries who had been accused of protecting trafficking networks. The Manila folder from that day now sat in a place of honor at the center, next to the ICC verdict and letters from trafficking survivors around the world. But the real legacy wasn't in any document. It was in the lives that had been saved and the democratic institutions that had been strengthened. The wannabe Hitler had finally faced justice, but more importantly, the world had learned that no one, absolutely no one, is above the law when citizens have the courage to demand accountability. And sometimes, justice delayed is not justice denied. Sometimes it's justice amplified, echoing around the world and inspiring others to speak their own truths, no matter how powerful the people who prefer lies might be. The revolution that began with 2 words, wannabe Hitler, had become a global movement for truth, justice, and the protection of the innocent. And at its center stood a Congresswoman from Texas who had proven that sometimes the most powerful weapon against tyranny is simply the courage to tell the truth. If this story of courage in the face of authoritarianism inspired you, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Because when democracy is under attack, silence is complicity. Join us in supporting leaders who choose truth over party loyalty, children's safety over political convenience, and justice over power. The wannabe dictators are counting on us to stay quiet. Let's prove them wrong.